Howdy my totally as always Tubular gamers, and we're back with another ranking video. In today's ranking video, we're going to be ranking the Bionic Commando series. Now, Bionic Commando, for the uninitiated, is one of Capcom's longest running series of all time. It's one of their oldest series. It's one of the most classic games. The original Bionic Commando came out way back in the late 80s, and it's had games throughout numerous generations, and I thought today I'd come together and rank all of them. The original couple games were really unique because they were platformers where you couldn't actually jump, you couldn't platform, you could move left and right, and you would use your bionic arm, the wire action gameplay as it was later coined. And after that original arcade and NES game, there were a few more Bionic Commandos, and then it went pretty dark for a while, and then in the late 2000s, Bionic Commando resurfaced with Capcom trying to bring it back, including basically a throwback, two throwbacks really, to the old games, and then a modern, edgy AAA release. And unfortunately, none of these really panned out all that well for Capcom. Nothing was a huge success, and Bionic Commando's been pretty much silent since like the early 2010s. In fact, I think this is the longest we've gone actually without a Bionic Commando, and I don't see another one coming anytime soon. Bionic Commando has pretty much had nothing since Rearmed 2. Spencer's shown up in Marvel Vs Capcom twice, and there's been maybe a re-release of like that original arcade game, and that's it. So it's definitely one of Capcom's more forgotten series, but that doesn't mean it's one of their lesser desired series. I still think Bionic Commando has some merit to it. It's definitely, again, one of their more classic series. It's not Resident Evil or Street Fighter or Mega Man or even one of their more B-tier series like Dead Rising. It's definitely the C tier, but Bionic Commando, there's still some fun to be had here, and so let's just get right into it. Let's rank them worst to best. This is just based on how these games have aged, my feelings, and all that stuff. Let me know your favorite down below. Like, share, comment, all that good stuff. Let's get right into it. What do I think is the worst of this series? And so here we have Bionic Commando Elite Forces, released for the Game Boy Color by Nintendo actually in 2000. This game actually had like nothing to do with Capcom other than them licensing out the IP. And despite being made by Nintendo, this game really isn't as good as it should be. The game does play very similar to the other Bionic Commando games. It's just as clunky, you still can't jump, and you gotta swing all over the place. But the game definitely feels a lot more compact thanks to it being on the Game Boy Color. At least the presentation and the music was pretty decent for the time. The plot is actually totally different from like any other Bionic Commando. The plot is pretty much the same as the original game with a small twist in it. It's basically, about this peaceful land being terrorized by an evil man. This game's known as Arturius. And they have their evil group known as the Avars, and really the most elite forces have been sent in to stop the Avars, particularly people with bionic arms. You can actually be more than one different character here. I'll just be the girl. Unfortunately, they do not have the personality that Spencer had. I actually kind of liked his attitude and his general demeanor. These characters that you play as here, no. The story's pretty whatever. The gameplay though, like I said, it's very similar to those original games. It's a lot more compact. It's still hard as balls. Like, this game is really freaking difficult. This is one of the most difficult games in the series. It is not messing around. You need to be basically pixel perfect with your bionic arm, and it gets just as clunky as you'd imagine. I think the clunkiness is probably my biggest reason I don't have it so high on this list. Is it just feels even clunkier than like the NES game, and it was just really hard to get used to this. In fact, I just never really got used to it actually. And because I could never really get used to the controls all that much and the swinging and the physics and all that, I just had a really hard time getting into this game. Not only actually getting anywhere in it because it is difficult, but really just, again, getting into it. Not all of the levels are 2D platformers. Some of them are top-down shooters. These are better. And then there's some auto-scroller segments. And all in all, I wouldn't say that this is a bad game. I would say it's just very middling, and I really wouldn't recommend it. I don't love platformers on the Game Boy outside of like Super Mario Land, and even that I barely like. And this isn't one of those that I really like very much. And so here we have the original Bionic Commando releasing all the way back in 1987 for the arcades. It did have some PC ports, but I've only ever tried the arcade version that's been on the many Capcom re-releases. Now, the original game was actually advertised in the US as a sequel to Commando, but this is not part of the Commando series. Commando is not related to Bionic Commando. Now, despite sharing the same name as the NES game, this game is actually pretty different. It takes place 10 years after an unspecified world war between two warring factions, and the game follows a commando who must infiltrate an enemy base and foil the enemy's plot to launch the missiles. Does it sound generic? Oh yes it does, and the main character doesn't even have a real name. They referred to him as Super Joe in that original promotional material, but yeah, it's not Super Joe. But enough about that. How does the game play these days? It still is that arcade run and gun platformer with the bionic arm. You can't jump, and so you gotta use the arm for everything, and it's kinda interesting that this was an arcade game. It just doesn't really strike me as an arcade game, especially nowadays, and thanks to, it being an arcade game, it's not exactly long, but it is really difficult. And you'll be swinging all over. You'll swing through jungles, ruins, bases. You'll be swinging through a bunch of different things. You can swing in a couple different directions, but you can only shoot forward. And yeah, that's really what it is a running gunner. As you try to make your way through these pretty simple levels, just shooting everything that pretty much moves and swinging along. It isn't the most complex game, but again, it is quite challenging. The enemies just usually spawn like crazy, and it's actually pretty hard to dodge them sometimes. On top of the clunky-ish controls, and you've got a recipe for putting a lot of quarters in, or pressing a lot of the continue button if you're playing on a collection. Yeah, I died so many times in this game, it's not even funny. If you don't like die and suck, so not me, you could probably finish this game in like 20 minutes. It is an arcade game after all, but if you're dying a bunch, it's going to take a little bit longer. This game is a certified classic. Nobody's ever going to take that away from it, but when you compare all the Bionic Commandos, it doesn't exactly rank that high for me. But this game is one of those games that helped define Capcom's legacy, and they probably wouldn't be here today without it, so I'll give it that. But playing it in 2023, yeah, it's a bit rough. And so here we have Bionic Commando Rearmed 2 releasing in 2011. This is actually the latest Bionic Commando game. Yeah, we have not had one in quite some time. And so my question is, was this game that bad that it basically killed off the franchise? Well, I wouldn't say this game is particularly great, and I think the mixed reception it got is about what it deserves. The game takes place after Rearmed 1, but before 2009's Bionic Commando, and in the game it sees a new dictator, General Sabo, show up on these islands and threaten to attack Rad Spencer's organization, and so it's up to him to stop it with his new mustache. I was never really big on this game's character design, but that's not really important. The plot is fine enough, it gets things going, and it actually has a decent amount of progression. They try to tell some kind of story here. It's pretty whatever. But enough about that. How does the game play? Well, it plays decently similar to Rearmed. It is a 2.5D platformer where you're swinging on the background and killing a bunch of enemies. The first thing I'll say is that the swinging has been altered a bit, the controls are a little different, and the physics are also a bit different, and it feels actually rather different from almost every other Bionic Commando, and it took me a hot minute to even try to get adjusted to this, and I just wasn't big on the controls. The other thing this game has is a jump. Yes, you can actually jump in this game. It's the only 2D Bionic Commando game that you can jump in, and it just doesn't feel great. Like, I don't know, there's just something about this that feels wrong. And when you beat the game, you can actually turn the jump off, and so that makes me question why it's really even here to begin with. Is it here to make the game easier? It definitely made the game easier. Like, the game is not as hard as Rearmed, but I also would say that the level design is nowhere near as good as Rearmed. I think that this game's level design is shoddy at best, and at worst it's just pretty mediocre. Spencer also can get a number of abilities, like he can shoot grenades, and you can even get him to regenerate health. You have to go to this menu though to change out your abilities and upgrades, which is a bit odd, but it really feels like they tried to expand on Rad Spencer's like movement and abilities, and I just don't really know how well this works in the long run, because I feel like Bionic Commando, especially Rearmed, it really thrived because it was simple to understand. There wasn't a lot going on here. You like swung around with your arm and you changed weapons and shot stuff. Like, there wasn't a lot to it, and there didn't need to be. That was kind of what made it great. I just think this game, it introduces a bunch of stuff, but it doesn't really actually add anything to the gameplay. It doesn't make it better. It doesn't enhance it in any way. On top of the, again, shoddy level design, so-so plot, and whatever presentation. The frame rate was even a bit suspicious here as well. It's like this game doesn't look amazing, especially not for 2011. The music wasn't even all that good either. It's like, okay, I'm sorry, Rearmed is just a lot better. This game feels a bit watered down by comparison, and I don't think it should have killed the whole series off, but I wouldn't exactly recommend this game. And so here we have Bionic Commando 2009 releasing for the 360, PS3, and PC. Now this was going to be the big budget AAA Bionic Commando game that Capcom really wanted to take off. If you couldn't tell, this game did not take off for a few reasons. The game sees you playing as Spencer, who looks drastically different, going into a city to stop some terrorists with his giant bionic arm. Now there's a lot more to this story, but really, the less said the better, as this is one of the most nonsensical stories I've seen in a game from this era. And yeah, Spencer's wife is somehow in his arm. It's as dumb as it sounds. I thought it was really stupid back over a decade ago, and even nowadays I'm like, this is still really stupid. The game does have a number of cutscenes. It tries to have some twists that are crazy predictable, and yeah, the story, it's just bad. The gameplay is a third-person shooter with a lot of platforming with the bionic arm. You can jump here, but it's not really an issue. The game doesn't do anything particularly awful or even all that bad, to be honest. Sure, it's finicky, sometimes it's a bit awkward, and in certain situations it can get really awkward, but I'll be real, I think the swinging actually feels good for the most part. The platforming and general swinging is the best part of this game. No, it's not Spider-Man, any Spider-Man game. It's not the Attack on Titan game, and it's not even Earth Defense Force Iron Rain. But this isn't half bad. You can even get some decent momentum with it. The shooting though is fairly basic. There's just not much here when it comes to it, and it feels a bit generic. None of the weapons feel all that great, none of the enemies are really interesting. The locations are all really generic though, and nothing really stands out. This game, I would say, is very middling to average. There can be some fun here, especially when you're just swinging around. The game even looks pretty decent for the time, but I think this game could have been so much more, and Spencer could have been so much more fun to play as. I mean, he's pretty fun in Marvel Vs Capcom, where he just kind of goes nuts with the bionic arm, and I think that this game really should have just done more. And what doesn't help things is that this game came out in like mid-2009 and was just buried under all the much better games that 2009 had, like Infamous and Arkham Asylum, and the list just goes on and on. This game was pretty much yeeted out of everyone's mind pretty much right after it came out, unless you're talking about Bionic Commando as a whole, and there's a reason nobody's talking about this game. And even when you're talking about Capcom games, it's just not really worth playing. And I mean, it's not awful, but it's a shame it wasn't better. It really just should have been so much more than what we got. And so here we have Bionic Commando, released for the NES and eventually the Game Boy. Now Bionic Commando, despite sharing the same name as the arcade game, this game was actually pretty decently different from it, aside from, you know, the bionic arm. I also think it's a lot better than that original arcade game. I think when people think of classic Bionic Commando, they're thinking of this game. The original game actually did not have your character named Rad Spencer. Their name was Lad, but in later re-releases, yeah, he became Nathan Rad Spencer. I feel like that's a name he gave himself when he was like 9 years old and stuck with it. But you know what? Cool enough name, and he kind of looks like Duke Nukem. The game takes place in the 80s and centers around two warring states, the Federation and the Empire. One of them is clearly supposed to be Nazis. That's the Empire, if you couldn't tell, and you're sent in to not only rescue Super Joe, the main character from Commando, but really stop the Empire as a whole. And you know, for a basic NES game, an early NES game, I think the plot is pretty alright, and there's actually a decent amount of dialogue here, rife with spelling errors, but yeah, it's got some charm to it, even nowadays. But when playing Bionic Commando, it isn't all that different from that original arcade game. It's just heavily expanded on. It still is a platform game where you do not jump, you just swing around, and these levels are created to accommodate swinging around all over the place. You also get to shoot enemies, and you get a number of different weapons. It isn't just the 2D levels either. There is actually an overworld that you get to move around on, and you don't go in order either. And then there's even some top-down sections, and these are fine enough. But I think the game is at its best during these 2D levels. Again, I think the level design is actually pretty solid. I'd say it's pretty good. It does take a hot minute to get used to the controls. Like, you will not get used to the bionic arm immediately. You won't get used to it after an hour. It's going to take a while to get used to it, and it is clunky, but once you get it going, you can really get going with this bionic arm, and shooting enemies is fine enough. And it's thanks to this that this game is not messing around. This is actually a really difficult game, and it gets balls to the walls difficult towards the end of the game, where it will just kick your shit in, and it is no problem kicking it in. And along with this learning curve, the game is actually just incredibly difficult. They really want you to master this bionic arm, and by the end of the game, they just have no problem kicking your shit in. Like, this is NES balls to the walls hard. It's a real challenge. But I would say it's one of those more rewarding challenges where it does feel really good to actually get hella good at the bionic arm and make it through some of these levels. It didn't take me 1 try, 2 try, more like 3 or 4 tries to get through some of these levels, but once I finally did, yeah, it actually felt pretty rewarding. The game does have a decent amount of secrets to it as well, and there are some little areas where it's non-hostile zones where you can actually just check out the base. And I mean, how many 2D platformers on the NES had friendly zones? I think that's kind of cool. Bionic Commando, obviously, it's aged, it's very difficult, and it can feel archaic in many aspects, but I still think that it is a certified classic, and that Game Boy version, it really is like the same game, and I think that's actually kind of commendable that the Game Boy was able to have that original NES version. And I think that when it comes to Capcom NES games, this is actually one of the better ones, and that's saying a lot. They have a lot of amazing NES games. And if you're looking for an old school platformer with a lot of challenge, Bionic Commando, it might be the game for you. Maybe. And so here we have what I believe to be the best Bionic Commando, Bionic Commando Rearmed, releasing in 2009. The game is actually a remake of that original NES game, and it adds some new stuff here and there, but it feels and looks just a hell of a lot better than that original game. One of the reasons this game was made was to hype up that 2009 AAA reboot, but this game ended up not only selling way more, but being just a much better game. The first thing I can bring up is the graphics. Obviously, it looks just a tad better than the NES game. This was a $10 budget Xbox Live Arcade game, but yeah, it looks just a little better than the NES game. Okay, it looks a lot better than the NES game, and I think it actually looks pretty good. The music is mostly that original music, but modernized, remixed, redone, whatever you want to call it, it sounds great, and I actually think the music's pretty great in this game. When it comes to the story, it's basically the exact same story, only now it's officially Rad Spencer versus whoever the first game was claiming he was. But the plot, yeah, it's exactly the same, and it's just as charming, and all the typos have been fixed, so that's nice. I actually think the plot here is pretty solid. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, it's incredibly faithful to the original, only there's a lot of modern sensibilities here, not just in the controls, but the game itself and how it's structured, such as the health makes a bit more sense. You can switch weapons whenever you want versus only 1 weapon per mission. You can actually grab these barrels and throw them. All the bosses have been reworked, and just fighting the enemies feels a lot nicer than it did in that original game. The bionic arm itself can still feel clunky as hell at times, but this is probably the best that the arm has ever felt in any of the Bionic Commando games, and yeah, even with its awkwardness, it can still actually be pretty fun, especially once you get the hang of it, then it can be really fun. This game though, when it comes to its difficulty, it absolutely retained that from the NES game. Despite these new additions, it is still incredibly difficult, and I died tons of times in this game. That final level is still incredibly difficult. It is like ball-crushingly difficult, and I really still had a hard time with it. I think that this game, it really is just without a doubt the superior way to play the original game. It looks better, plays better, feels better, is just nicer to look at, and I feel like they really captured the spirit of that original NES game and just made it much more modern. It's still a beloved 2D platformer, and you know, all these years later, it's the best in the Bionic Commando series. Yeah, sometimes it feels like your character can be moving in slow-mo or can get caught up in things, but it's stuff you just get really used to. It's still an incredibly unique platformer. There's really never been another platformer series it feels like that was like Bionic Commando. There's some similar enough ones, sure, and there's some indie ones that are decently similar, but none of them hit like Bionic Commando did, and none of them really hit like how Bionic Commando Rearmed did. If you were going to play just one Bionic Commando game, you just wanted to try the series out, I would recommend Bionic Commando Rearmed. It's on Steam, it's on Xbox Live and PSN, and I think that, yeah, it is actually worth playing, especially if you like 2D platformers. Be prepared for a challenging time, but I still think it holds up, and it's still a pretty solid little game. It's not going to take you more than maybe a day, a couple sittings at most, but there's a reason it's a classic. It's because it's still actually pretty good, and it's going to kick your ass. Anyway, that's it for this video. Hope you all enjoyed. Have a good one, everyone. See you later. Thanks to the one Patreon who subbed. Bye-bye.